as everyone seems to know by now, 2020 has basically been an absolute train wreck of a year, predominantly because of the ongoing coronavirus disease 2019 pandemic that's been going on all year and quite frankly doesn't seem to be ending anytime soon. It might feel like we haven't really been here before in recent history, but we have, about a century ago with the Spanish flu. The Spanish flu, so called because it didn't actually speak Spanish, devastated the world immediately after World War I and killed 17 to 50 million people, infecting a grand total of around 500 million. Now, this video is going to be a bit more serious than my normal videos, but this is easily one of the most important videos I've ever made thus far in my career as an edutuber. I make this video not to scare people or to attract clickbait views for my own profit, but so we can look to our past and actually learn from it and just how bad everything got the last time around. The year is 1918, the beginning of the outbreak of a new and rapidly mutating strain of influenza. The outbreak began early in the year, not in Spain, but most likely somewhere in North America. Though there are actually multiple theories as to where the virus came from, the first plausible and identified cases happened within Kansas. Though the first cases likely happened as early as January, the first reported case was that of Army cook Albert Gitchell, serving at Camp Funston in Kansas. After that, the virus quickly spread, reportedly infecting 522 in the camp within just a few days, and already reaching New York by the 11th. At this time, although fashionably late to the party, the US was embroiled in World War I, which meant that the Army was training and transporting troops all around the country, and shipping them off to the front lines in Europe, conscripting men aged 18 to 45 from all across the country. The war effort didn't just mean gathering people from across the country into one place and sending them all off to a faraway land. What this also meant was that American industry was booming, with millions moving into the cities to join the workforce and aid in the war effort, promised by the sudden influx of available jobs. However, most cities didn't have enough space to properly accommodate all the new arrivals, with multiple families frequently having to share single-room apartments, with some even sharing beds in shifts. Now, as I'm sure you've already heard, the war was also the reason this pandemic would be named after a country it barely even affected and most certainly didn't originate from. No, for real, it would be like calling COVID-19 the New Zealand virus. Like, really? If you don't already know the story, this is simply because everyone else was fighting in the war and so suppressed stories about the outbreak in order to keep up public morale. But of course, Spain, being neutral, didn't need to do this. And so the first news stories that a lot of people might have heard of this virus would have probably been published in Spanish and had a lisp. This attitude of censoring stories about the virus and pretending everything was fine, however, would come to bite them in the culo. From American factories at home to army camps overseas, the virus continued to spread, covering the Midwest and the East Coast and reaching French ports by April, reaching the Western Front only a couple weeks later, and from there spreading throughout Western Europe. Barely a month prior, Russia ended their participation in the war with the Treaty of Brest-Litovsk. However, this would also mean that Russian prisoners of war returning home from Germany would unknowingly bring the disease with them into Central and Eastern Europe, with outbreaks later reported in Wrocław and Odessa by May. By June, the virus had spread throughout most of Africa and Asia and had reached Australia by July. However, once it had reached around the world, the virus started to dissipate, having been only a relatively mild outbreak. This, however, was only the first wave. The second wave happened later that year, but would be far, far deadlier. Though it had already hugely affected the outcome of the war, the first wave seemed little more than a slightly stronger version of a typical flu, only really killing the elderly and those with pre-existing conditions. Since viruses have a tendency to mutate and adapt to their hosts, however, it only took until mid-1918 for the virus to reach its deadliest potential, at which point it actually started becoming deadlier to the young and healthy, who were killed essentially by their strong immune systems being kicked into overdrive. Though the virus became deadlier, government and society wouldn't get much stronger in combating it. As the disease started to peak in September, cities across the US had some very different reactions. New York, for instance, instituted a quarantine very early on, and as a result only suffered 458 deaths per 100,000. St. Louis put forth even stronger measures and fared even better, with only 358 deaths per 100,000, though it briefly faced a sharp increase once physical distancing measures were temporarily relaxed a little too soon. Philadelphia, however, wasn't so smart about this. Philadelphia Public Health Director William Kruzan largely ignored the pandemic, making no preparations at all and denying that it even afflicted the city at all. And thus, when a massive end-of-the-war parade was held on the 28th of September, with over 200,000 people said to have jammed onto Broad Street, and one that other cities had largely called off, the effects were predictable. The flu's incubation period was 24 to 72 hours, and within 72 hours, all available hospital beds and all available morgues in the city were filled to the brim with the infected. Many, once showing the first symptoms, would die within 12 hours. Although the scientific community was racing around the clock for a solution or even a cause to this outbreak, world governments weren't exactly quite as anxious about the virus. US President Woodrow Wilson, for example, never even acknowledged the virus sweeping his country and refused to divert resources to the effort. Governments and newspapers largely suppressed news of the outbreak. However, in the vacuum of information that resulted from this, rumors would take over, ranging from false beliefs of noxious gas rising from the graves at Flanders Fields and spreading around the world, to aspirin tablets allegedly being poisoned by German pharmaceutical company Bayer. That being said, measures such as physical distancing, face masks, and banning public gatherings became commonplace around the world, with some island nations even temporarily shutting down their borders. These measures were enforced at very different levels in different cities, however, and even then, there were still groups protesting the wearing of masks. The pandemic would finally end after two smaller waves, one in early 1919 and one in January 1920, when the virus essentially ran out of available hosts and effectively snuffed itself out, but not before taking at least 2% of the world's population with it, killing an estimated 17 to 50 million people, though some estimates go as high as 100 million. Roughly equivalent to the entire US population at the time. Worldwide, upwards of 500 million people would contract the disease at some point, over a quarter of the world population. Even in those who survived the flu, there were still lasting symptoms, notably mental instability long afterwards, as had happened with Woodrow Wilson after he had contracted the illness, likely even causing him to reverse his stance on the post-war peace treaties with the Central Powers, setting forth the chain of events that didn't exactly go well for Germany's Jewish population 20 years later. Shifting back to the current pandemic, now, I'm sorry if you feel this is political because, let's be honest, it really isn't, but COVID-19 is serious. It is not just a slightly stronger flu that will just go away if we will it to, and just because the fatality rate is only 1%, doesn't mean the other 99% will be perfectly fine or even immune to getting the virus a second time. Many survivors still have lasting symptoms or immune systems otherwise damaged from fighting the virus. And even if it does snuff itself out the way the Spanish flu did, 75 million people is still a lot of people. You might have heard the quote, "Those who do not remember their history are doomed to repeat it," something that now seems all the more relevant with how we handle the current pandemic. We've made a lot of progress, both scientific and social, in the last 100 years. Hell, I briefly even made a series about it last year before it turned out not to be all that popular. But clearly we haven't spent that last century figuring out how to combat future pandemics. To be somewhat fair, pandemics don't really happen as much as rain derailments or rocket explosions or hacking incidents, so it kind of makes sense as to why we only really think about pandemics whenever one's actually actively happening. But if we don't at least learn something from 1920 or 2020, we can only hope the next pandemic is as understanding. Thanks as always for watching. Now, believe it or not, this video was not meant to scare you, just to hopefully make you more aware of what happened with the previous pandemic on this scale and how to make sure we don't blindly go down the same path we already went down. Anyways, consider supporting me on Patreon in case this video gets demonetized, and as always, be sure to like, share, and subscribe to learn something new every Sunday.